A phone vibrates against a table, and one accidental invitation opens the door to 72 hours of Miami heat, flashing lights, wounded pride, and a man trying to prove that the world has not moved on without him. That vibration is the image I keep returning to in 72 hours, not the biggest joke, not the loudest party. Just a small atomic pulse, the kind most of us barely notice, arriving at exactly the wrong moment and becoming impossible to ignore. Because beneath the alcohol, the boats, the hotel rooms, the generational misunderstandings, and the escalating absurdity, there is a quieter fear moving through the film. What happens when an invitation feels less like an opportunity and more like proof that you are still visible? This is the influx, a place for those of us who do not only ask whether a film works, but what it is reaching for when it tries. We stay with the image after the joke has passed, listen for the feeling underneath the soundtrack, and notice the emotional shape hidden inside a familiar genre. Sometimes that means finding one honest idea inside a film that never fully becomes what it could have been. And with 72 hours, it means looking past the bright surface of a broad comedy to find a man standing at the edge of another generation's world, wondering whether he still knows how to enter. There is an easy way to watch this film. You can treat it as a collision between ages, styles, and comic rhythms. Every day, your old executive falls into the orbit of a much younger bachelor party, and the movie builds its energy from the gap between them. He speaks with the confidence of someone who once understood the culture around him. They move with the ease of people who have never had to ask whether the culture belongs to them. The comedy lives in that distance, but the feeling lives somewhere else. It lives in the moment before someone tries too hard. It lives in the fraction of a second when a joke becomes a defense. It lives in the way a person can confuse being included with being needed. That is the emotional thread I want us to follow together. Not because 72 hours is secretly solemn, and not because every wild comedy needs to be translated into tragedy. Laughter can remain laughter. Chaos can simply be chaos. But comedy has always been one of cinema's sharpest ways of revealing fear. The body moves faster when dignity is slipping. The voice gets louder when confidence is thinning. A room becomes more ridiculous when one person inside it is desperate to belong. This film gives us a character who keeps answering uncertainty with momentum. He moved toward the next party, the next plan, the next attempt to impress people young enough to represent everything he thinks he has lost. The faster the weekend becomes, the harder it is for him to admit what he's chasing. Is it professional relevance, youth, admiration, escape, or just a relief of entering a room where nobody has already decided who he is? Think about what that means. The accidental group chat invitation is funny because it is improbable, but it is also emotionally precise. So much of modern life arrives as a notification, an offer, a rejection, a reminder, a message left unanswered, a photograph proving that everyone else was somewhere you were not. A screen lights up, and for 1 second it appears to tell you where you stand in the world. 72 hours takes that ordinary anxiety and pushes it into the exaggerated language of a bachelor party comedy. One mistaken addition becomes a temporary passport into youth, friendship, danger, performance, and self deception. As we move through the film, I want to keep listening for that forced vibration. At the beginning, it sounds like possibility. Later, it begins to sound like pressure. Eventually, it may reveal itself as something more intimate, the noise a person makes when silence would force him to confront his own life. we will look at what the film understands about aging in public, about trying to remain current when culture reinvents itself every few minutes, and about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who are laughing with you while you are unsure whether they truly see you. We will also be honest about where the film settles for easy jokes, where its characters become thinner than its ideas, and where the energy of the premise outruns the emotional depth the story needs. But before we enter the party, before the music rises and the weekend accelerates, we need to look at the word waiting outside that glowing phone screen. Because a comedy about generational collision does not appear in a vacuum. It arrives at a moment when age has become a public performance, relevance has become measurable, and even identity can feel like something refreshed by the hour. The invitation may be accidental. The anxiety behind accepting it is not. Because outside that glowing phone screen is a culture that has learned to treat relevance as something visible, countable, and constantly expiring. A person is trending or disappearing, included in the conversation or watching it move without them. The group chat in 72 hours is more than a doorway into the plot. It belongs to a world in which access can be granted by a tap, and an accidental notification can feel more meaningful than a deliberate conversation. The film arrived on Netflix on July 24, 2026, entering homes rather than asking people to gather in theaters. That matters to the kind of comedy it is. Its ancestors were built for crowded rooms, where laughter moved from one stranger to another, and outrageous behavior grew through collective reaction. Here the same bachelor party chaos enters through an individual screen, surrounded by recommendations, thumbnails, and a demand for immediate attention. The film is about a man fighting to remain relevant, and it was released into a system where every movie is fighting the same battle. That makes its first week success strangely appropriate. Netflix reported 22 million views and placed the film at number 1 on its global movie chart. People pressed play in enormous numbers, perhaps because Kevin Hart remains instantly recognizable, perhaps because the premise can be understood in a sentence, and perhaps because a loud weekend comedy promises relief from a culture that rarely stops asking us to process something. Yet visibility and affection are not the same thing. The film became widely watched while receiving a far colder response from critics. At the time of this essay, Rotten Tomatoes lists a 16% critics score from 31 reviews and a 51% audience score from more than 250 ratings. That is not a dramatic reversal in which critics rejected something the public embraced. It is a smaller, more revealing divide. Many critics saw a tired structure, uneven jokes, and a film leaning too heavily on the shadow of the hangover. The audience response was warmer, but still divided. Some found the cast easy to spend time with. Others felt that the party kept becoming louder without becoming funnier. And this is where the movie becomes an object of its own theme. Joe worries that the language of comedy, culture, and professional life has changed around him. The film seems to carry a similar anxiety. It brings together Kevin Hart, whose screen persona was shaped by an earlier era of theatrical star comedy, and younger performers whose timing was formed in a world of short clips, social feeds, podcasts, and sketches that can travel before a feature film has finished its opening weekend. Their collision is not only written into the story, it exists in the casting. You can feel two comic eras testing each other. Hart creates momentum through physical panic, wounded confidence, escalating volume, and the spectacle of a man trying to control a room that has escaped him. The younger group brings a looser, more conversational rhythm. Their humor can feel less like a prepared punchline and more like the sudden turn of a private exchange. When those rhythms meet, the film occasionally finds something alive. There is exposes how hard Joe is working. That tension belongs specifically to 2026. Generational identity has become one of the internet's favorite forms of shorthand. People are reduced to the decade that raised them, the technology they first used, the slang they understand, and the habits younger people have decided to mock. Age becomes content. A pause before answering the wrong emoji or an outdated reference can become evidence that someone no longer belongs. The film exaggerates this cruelty into comedy, but it understands the pressure beneath it. Joe wants the younger men's approval to certify that he has not become obsolete. His career deepens that fear. Advertising sells the promise of remaining current, but contemporary branding moves at the speed of online reaction. A person who once understood what people wanted can suddenly be told that their instincts belong to another age. Joe joins the weekend because he believes proximity to youth might restore his professional value. He treats people as a bridge back to relevance before he learns to see them as people. Cinema has visited this territory before, the middle-aged figure entering a younger world, the respectable adult surrendering to a chaotic weekend, the bachelor party becoming a temporary nation with its own laws. 72 Hours does not hide that inheritance. Its Miami excess, criminal detours, bodily humiliation, and worsening decisions place it inside a familiar tradition of American studio comedy. The problem is not that a film inherits an old shape. The real question is whether the new pressure inside that shape changes its meaning. Sometimes it does. The group chat is a distinctly contemporary accident. The fear of being professionally aged out feels current. The mixture of public performance and private insecurity gives the premise a pulse. But sometimes the fin reaches backward for jokes that the younger characters themselves recognize as exhausted. Is the movie criticizing outdated comic instincts or depending on them? Is Joe revealing the limitations of his generation, or is the story merely giving those limitations another stage? The critical response turned on that uncertainty. The Associated Press and Variety recognized the appeal of the younger ensemble while describing the plotting as familiar and the comedy as inconsistent. The Guardian was harsher about the way Hart's established persona dominates the film. RogerEbert.com, however, found an unexpectedly existential quality in the material, reading it as a reflection of an entertainer confronting his changing place within popular culture. Different reactions, but one shared question. Does the film understand its anxiety deeply enough, or does it only recognize that the anxiety exists? Its streaming life has begun with extraordinary reach, but whether it develops a second life is impossible to know. The movie is also far too new to possess a meaningful awards history. A number one debut proves curiosity, not endurance. The test will come when the algorithm stops placing the film in front of everyone. Will people return for the chemistry, the generational friction, and the sadness beneath Hart's frantic performance? Or will 72 hours remain attached to the week it arrived, consumed quickly, and replaced by the next bright square? That may be the most honest way to describe its place in time. It does not feel timeless. It feels intensely, almost anxiously current. Its phones, rhythms, references, and generational arguments belong to a culture terrified of falling behind. And perhaps that is why the opening notification matters so much. It does not merely invite Joe into a party. It offers him a temporary escape from the year he is living in, even as every person he meets reminds him exactly where he stands within it. To understand what he does with that invitation, we now have to step closer to the title, the faces, and the kind of comedy this film believes it can become. That title gives the weekend a boundary. 72 hours, long enough to abandon routine, short enough to pretend nothing has permanently changed. The number becomes a promise and a warning. Joe does not believe he is entering a new life. He believes he is borrowing one. Released in 2006 and directed by Tim Story, 72 Hours is an R-rated Netflix comedy led by Kevin Hart as Joe, an accomplished advertising executive whose instincts are suddenly judged to be out of step with younger consumers. When he is mistakenly added to a group chat for a Miami bachelor party, he sees more than an administrative error. He sees access to the generation his employers think he no longer understands. So he does what frightened people often do in comedies. He converts insecurity into a plan and convinces himself that the plan is rational. Waiting in Miami is not a carefully selected research group, but a friendship already in motion. Mason Gooding plays Mason, the grounded groom-to-be, whose calmness gives the weekend something to orbit. Marcelo Hernandez is Nick Mason's childhood friend and the best man, whose excitement is tangled with fear that marriage will change the bond he depends on. Ben Marshall plays Hunter, carrying romantic disappointment into a celebration built around someone else's happiness, while Cam Patterson's freshman brings an openness that makes him more than the youngest member of the crew. Tehana Taylor appears as Jennifer, Joe's long-term partner, and the surrounding cast includes Zach Cherry, Michael Mando, Andy Garcia, Mike Epps, and Cat Williams. On paper, this is a raunchy, high-energy bachelor party comedy, Miami sunlight, crowded rooms, bad decisions, damaged plans, and consequences arriving faster than anyone can process them. Yet at its heart, the film is built around two different forms of separation. Joe is afraid of being separated from the culture that once rewarded him. Nick is afraid of being separated from the friend whose marriage signals adulthood moving forward. One man runs toward youth because he thinks it can restore his future. Another clings to youth because he thinks the future will take something away. That parallel is where the premise becomes more interesting than a simple old versus young collision. Joe enters the group believing that age is the distance between them. The more important distance is emotional. The younger men are already honest with one another in ways Joe finds uncomfortable. You can be ridiculous without always pretending to be invulnerable. Joe, by contrast, has spent years converting uncertainty into performance. He knows how to pitch an idea, defend a position, and make confidence look natural. He is less skilled at admitting that confidence has begun to cost him. Tim Story's direction places this tension inside the broad, accessible comic language that has defined much of his work. He understands the usefulness of an ensemble. One performer pushes the scene outward, another quietly pulls it back, and the contrast creates rhythm. Here, Hart supplies urgency while the younger cast often supplies looseness. Joe keeps trying to become the center of the weekend. But the film is most revealing when the group refuses to reorganize itself around him. That does not make 72 Hours a subtle character drama disguised as a comedy. It remains committed to spectacle, embarrassment, and escalation. Its world is deliberately heightened. Miami becomes less a city than a temperature bright, restless, expensive looking, and always threatening to become too much. The locations keep offering Joe another surface on which to project the version of himself he wants these strangers to believe. So, should you watch it? You should, if the idea of Kevin Hart colliding with a younger comic ensemble is enough to carry you through uneven material. If you enjoy party comedies whose momentum comes from one mistake producing five more, or if you are curious about a familiar genre trying to speak about aging, friendship, and cultural events. The film is not consistently sharp, and its loudest instincts sometimes bury its better observations. But there are moments when the generational friction stops behaving like a gimmick and becomes a genuine exchange. Watch it less for the promise of discovering a new comic form than for the flashes of vulnerability inside an old one. Watch the pauses after Joe performs confidence. Watch how quickly the younger men notice what he is trying to conceal, and keep listening for that phone vibration because the invitation has now done its work. Joe has crossed into their world. The next question is what a film makes us feel when he arrives. The film first meets Joe not as a man who has already failed, but as a man still performing the version of himself that used to succeed. He enters the story with the force of someone accustomed to controlling the temperature of a room. His language is quick, his certainty arrives before anyone has asked for it, and his professional identity seems polished enough to hide every crack. Yet, the opening does not let that confidence remain uncomplicated. His latest attempts to speak to younger consumers have fallen flat, and the people around him are beginning to question whether the instincts that built his career can still recognize the present. Emotionally, that is a sharper beginning than the premise may lead you to expect. A bachelor party comedy promises escape, but the film begins with evaluation. Joe is being measured before he ever reaches Miami. The bright offices, commercial language, and professional urgency create a different kind of pressure from the chaos waiting later. Nothing has exploded yet. Nobody is running. Still, Joe already behaves as though something is chasing him. This is where Kevin Hart's familiar velocity becomes useful. The performance does not initially ask us to see Joe as defeated. It shows us a man trying to outrun the possibility of defeat by speaking faster than doubt can form. Hart makes confidence look almost muscular, something Joe has trained himself to hold in place. When another person questions his understanding of younger people, the challenge lands deeper than a bad review of one campaign. It threatens the story he tells himself about why he matters. The atmosphere, therefore, begins with a strange mixture of speed and stillness. Joe moves quickly, but his life feels stalled. He has professional status, a long-term relationship, and the habits of an adult who should no longer need approval from strangers. Yet opening rhythm suggests that he cannot feel any of those things, unless they are reflected back to him as relevance. He is surrounded by evidence of stability and experiences it as confinement. Then the phone interrupts. The accidental addition to the bachelor party chat is staged as a comic mistake, but it arrives with the emotional clarity of temptation. The screen gives Joe what the room around him has withheld, the illusion of an opening. A younger word appears in fragments, messages, plans, private jokes, and the careless enthusiasm of people who assume the weekend belongs to them. Joe does not know these men, but he immediately begins converting their friendship into an answer to his own problem. That choice tells us almost everything. He does not pause long enough to ask whether entering their plans is honest, wise, or fair. He sees information and turns it into strategy. This is the reflex of an advertising executive who has spent years studying desire from the outside. He approaches the group not with curiosity, but with extraction in mind. Their language might save his campaign. Their habits might restore his authority. Their youth becomes something he believes he can observe, package, and carry home. And yet, the film does not make the decision feel entirely cold. Under the manipulation is genuine hunger. Joe is attracted to the chat because the men inside it sound unguarded. Their friendship appears noisy, imperfect, and alive. Nothing in their exchange feels optimized for a boardroom. They are not trying to prove that they understand their generation. They are simply living within it. That contrast establishes the opening's most effective emotional rhythm. Joe keeps performing. The younger men, before he has even met them, seem free from performance. Of course, the film will complicate that impression. They have their own fears, loyalties, and evasions. But from Joe's distance, they represent spontaneity itself. He mistakes their ease for a resource he can borrow. The premise may have suggested an immediate explosion of Miami excess, but the film initially builds through embarrassment, observation, and a small ethical compromise. That choice gives the comedy a useful foundation. We understand that the coming disaster will not begin with the Airbnb, the parties, or the dangerous people waiting beyond the group's control. It begins the instant Joe decides an accidental invitation can be treated as permission. Here is what I keep returning to. The vibration has not changed, but its meaning already has. At first it sounded like possibility. Now it sounds like a man receiving exactly the excuse he wanted. The phone does not pull Joe away from a secure life. It reveals how ready he was to leave that life unattended. So when he begins moving toward Miami, the film is not simply sending an older man into a younger comedy. It is sending a carefully maintained identity into a place where maintenance may become impossible. The opening has shown us the mask, the fear beneath it, and the decision that binds them together. Now the weekend can begin. Joe arrives in Miami carrying two versions of himself. The first is the stranger the group believes they have invited, an older man with money, confidence, connections, and an almost suspicious willingness to improve every part of their bachelor weekend. The second is the advertising executive hidden behind that generosity, quietly studying their language, reactions, and friendships for anything that might rescue his failing vodka campaign. He is not merely joining the party, he is turning it into research. That difference gives the early Miami scenes their uneasy rhythm. On the surface, Joe is giving. He upgrades the accommodation, covers expenses, and arrives with enough branded alcohol to transform an ordinary trip into something larger. Beneath the surface, every gift creates a debt the younger men do not know they are accumulating. Their attention becomes data, their private behavior becomes potential advertising material. Their trust begins generating value for someone else before they have even decided whether he belongs there. The film initially moves quickly through this deception because Joe himself refuses to sit with it. He keeps the weekend in motion. As long as another plan is beginning, another bottle is opening, or another destination is waiting, he does not have to confront the fact that he has entered a friendship under false pretenses. This is where the phone motive changes again. At first, the phone delivered an invitation. Now it becomes a private window through which Joe watches people who believe they are simply living. The group chat that once represented entry begins to resemble surveillance. The same technology that connected him to these strangers gives him a way to keep them at a distance, converting experience into content before it has time to become memory. Yet the men refuse to behave like the demographic Joe expects. He arrives prepared for a collection of stereotypes. Young people obsessed with screens, appearances, and instant gratification. Instead, their phones are less important than the relationships passing around them. The group teases constantly, but the teasing rests on years of familiarity. They check on one another's emotions with an openness Joe initially treats as strange. They preserve shared experiences in a physical scrapbook, creating something slow and tangible in a culture Joe assumes has abandoned both slowness and tangible things. That scrapbook quietly becomes the opposite of Joe's hidden footage. His recordings take without asking. The scrapbook is built through consent and affection. His material is collected for an audience that does not yet exist. The photographs matter because of the people who are there. One turns friendship into a product, the other protects friendship from disappearing. The film does something rare in these moments. It allows the supposedly outdated man to be the person most trapped by technology's commercial logic. Joe believes the younger men live through their devices, but he is the one who cannot stop translating life into marketable images. They are present in the weekend. He is already imagining how the weekend will appear after it has been edited. Mason the groom becomes the first real challenge to Joe's assumptions. He is younger, but he does not treat marriage as the end of freedom. His excitement is uncomplicated in a way Joe cannot understand. He knows the person he wants beside him, and he does not speak about commitment as though every chosen future is also a life sentence imposed on all the futures left behind. Joe hears that certainty while his own relationship with Jennifer remains suspended. She is considering a professional opportunity that could pull her away from New York, while he continues treating their shared future as a conversation that can always be postponed. The film keeps her mostly outside the physical space of the weekend, but emotionally she's everywhere. Each time Mason speaks with confidence about marriage, Joe is reminded of the question waiting for him at home. Nick responds to Mason's marriage differently. His jokes carry the energy of someone trying to turn fear into noise. He is not simply immature because the film needs a reckless best man. He is afraid that the ceremony will redraw the boundaries of their friendship. The party becomes his attempt to hold time still, to prove that the old version of the group can survive one more weekend exactly as it was. This places Joe and Nick on opposite sides of the same anxiety. Joe enters the trip because he wants to recover youth. Nick drags the trip forward because he wants to prevent youth from ending. Neither man understands that friendship cannot remain alive by refusing to change. They are both trying to protect something through performance. Hunter carries a quieter form of instability. His recent romantic pain makes him unusually fragile inside a celebration of lasting love. He wants to participate, but every reminder of Mason's certainty touches the uncertainty he has carried with him. The film uses his emotional openness for broad comedy, yet there is something recognizable in the way one person's happiness can eliminate another person's loneliness without diminishing either one. Frischman, meanwhile, often takes the word at its word. His literal responses create some of the film's cleanest comic beats, but they also give the group a kind of innocence. He does not constantly calculate how he appears, he reacts. In a story filled with disguising fear as strategy, bravado, or humor, his simplicity can feel unexpectedly honest. These personalities make the film both character driven and world driven. The external machinery is enormous: Miami nightlife, an expensive house, a yacht, escalating intoxication, strangers with concealed motives, and the growing possibility that the weekend has entered territory none of them understands. Yet, the chaos only matters because each character carries a private vulnerability into it. The world applies pressure, the characters reveal where they are already cracked. Joe's first night with the group turns his body into the place where his performance begins to fail. He wants to prove he can keep pace, but his physical reactions expose the difference between choosing to join and actually belonging to the rhythm of the people around him. The film repeatedly uses discomfort, exhaustion, and humiliation to puncture his authority. The executive, who controlled the Ruminant, becomes another body trapped in the back of a vehicle, unable to maintain dignity. He begged for the trip. Broad comedy often treats the body as a truth teller. The mind insists that everything is under control. The body refuses to cooperate. The yacht sequence pushes this idea into brighter, more exaggerated territory. Open water, luxury, music, and excess creates the image of total freedom. There are no office walls, no relationship conversations, and apparently no consequences. But this space is deceptive. The wider the horizon becomes, the more trapped Joe appears inside the role he has chosen. He cannot simply enjoy the party because he is always working. He needs usable behavior, spontaneous reactions, and proof that the brand can belong inside the lives of younger consumers. Even pleasure becomes a deadline. The hidden recording device turns every moment into a possible asset, and the phone in his pocket no longer vibrates with possibility. It vibrates with pressure. The film's pacing becomes most revealing here. It does not move with the careful escalation of a tightly constructed farce. It urges. One comic situation collides with another before the previous one has fully settled. A yacht encounter becomes a physical disaster. A strange meeting creates a misunderstanding that will matter later. The group moves from confidence to confusion so quickly that the weekend begins to feel less like an adventure than a machine swallowing their ability to choose. That unevenness can be frustrating, but it also mirrors Joe's method of Sabbath. Whenever a consequence approaches, the film throws him into another event. Whenever reflection threatens to begin, noise interrupts. The pacing is not always elegant, yet it expresses the central avoidance at the heart of the character. Joe does not process, he proceeds. The house itself deepens that instability. What appears to be an extravagant base for the celebration carries another purpose beneath its polished surfaces. The group believes it has entered a temporary paradise. In reality, the location connects them to people and activity far more dangerous than anything Joe anticipated when he decided to improve the booking. The weekend's luxury has been built over something concealed. So has Joe's generosity. That parallel gives the film one of its better structural ideas. The accommodation looks legitimate until its hidden function begins creating consequences. Joe looks generous until the hidden function of his generosity becomes impossible to ignore. Both the house and the man are presenting unattractive verses while quietly using the people inside them for another purpose. Still, the friendships deepen. Between the film's louder set pieces, Joe begins doing something he never planned to do. He listens. He hears Mason's certainty, Nick's fear, Hunter's heartbreak, and Freshman's unguarded way of moving through the world. He occasionally becomes useful, not because he understands their generation, but because he has lived long enough to recognize emotional patterns they cannot yet see. For the first time, age stops functioning only as a disadvantage. Joe can recognize that Nick's mockery is grief arriving early. He can see that Hunter's pain will not disappear through performance. He understands that a friendship can survive marriage, but not if everyone treats change as betrayal. The younger men begin accepting him not because he pays for everything, but because his experience sometimes gives their confusion a shape, and Joe begins liking them for reasons unrelated to the campaign. That is essential. Without genuine affection, his deception would remain merely cynical. With affection, it becomes tragic in miniature. Every sincere moment now sits beside an unseen violation. He may be emotionally present, but the recording device is still present too. He may have stopped thinking of them as market research, but he has not stopped collecting the material. Then the weekend loses its illusion of safety. A group of women they meet turns the men's confidence against them, leaving them disoriented and robbed. The incident strips away the glamour of the party and reveals how vulnerable they have become. Most possessions can be replaced, but the missing scrapbook carries a different weight. It contains no market value. Its importance comes from memory. Joe's response marks the beginning of a moral shift. Recovering it cannot save his campaign or secure his promotion. It matters because it matters to them. The man who entered the weekend to take something from the group now feels compelled to return something that belongs to them. But the film has already placed too many hidden things in motion. The true purpose of the house, the dangerous misunderstanding born on the yacht, the footage accumulating behind our backs, and the trust going around a lie. The phone is no longer an invitation, it is evidence, and here is where the film shifts completely. That shift becomes more revealing when you look at the machinery behind it, because 72 Hours was assembled through a similar meeting of established comic instincts and younger voices. The project was publicly announced in March 2025 as a Netflix comedy developed through Sony Pictures' first look arrangement with the streamer. John Horwitz and Hayden Schlossberg wrote the original draft, while Matt Mider and Kevin Barrows also received screenplay credit. Kevin Hart produced through Heartbeat alongside Will Packer, Davies Entertainment, Counterbalance Entertainment, and Tim Story's company. The collection of writers and producers helps explain why the film can feel like several traditions negotiating for space. You can sense the architecture of an escalating bachelor party farce, the invitation, the concealing motive, the intoxicating freedom, the criminal complication, and the collapse of every lie. Layered over it is a more contemporary argument about generational language and emotional openness. The screenplay works best when those layers touch. Joe's secret recordings express an older advertising machine trying to capture a younger culture without participating in it. The physical scrapbook answers with something slower and more human. The film was built by many hands, and you can sometimes see the seams. The second fact that changes the way the film looks is the reunion between Hart and Tim's story. Story previously directed Hart in both Ride Along films, so this was not a filmmaker learning the performer's rhythm for the first time. It was a return to an established comic partnership. You can see that familiarity whenever Joe's confidence collapses through movement. Story knows how long to let Hart control a scene before placing his body in a situation that makes control impossible. A professional speech becomes panic. A commanding posture becomes frantic retreat. Joe is repeatedly contrasted with cars, boats, rooms, crowds, and opponents that seem to expand as his certainty contracts. That rhythm is polished because actor and director already understand its mechanics, yet familiarity can become a limit. Some sequences appear designed around what Hart has reliably done before rather than what this character most needs. The collaboration gives the film velocity, but it occasionally protects the performance from stillness. Joe is most interesting when the noise fades and his face must hold the possibility that his life has moved somewhere he cannot follow. The casting created the film's more productive uncertainty. In June 2025, reports announced Teyana Taylor, Ben Marshall, Zach Sherry, and Cam Patterson as additions to a group that already included Hart, Marcelo Hernandez, and Mason Goody. Patterson's role marked his feature film debut. The younger ensemble does not come from one identical school of performance. Hernandez brings the precision of live sketch comedy. Marshall carries a deliberately casual rhythm. Patterson brings stand-up energy and unpredictability, while Gooding provides the steadier dramatic center the group requires. Their different temperatures create the feeling of a friendship that existed before Joe entered the frame. They interrupt, overlap, tease, and shift allegiance without waiting for him to understand the rules. That is why the group's chemistry often feels more convincing than the criminal plot surrounding it. Their bond has texture. The danger sometimes feels imported. Hart has described the younger cast in promotional conversation as hungry performers making the most of an opportunity, while Hernandez has spoken warmly about Hart's professionalism and the experience of learning from him. Those comments make the generational exchange visible behind the camera as well as within the story. It changes the feeling of Joe's better scenes with the group. The character believes he has arrived to study them, but the production placed an established star beside performers at earlier stages of their film careers. The learning does not travel in only one direction. Hart brings control and knowledge of how a large comedy set moves. The younger actors bring rhythms he cannot completely absorb or dominate. The fourth production detail is almost a visual joke of its own. The New Jersey Motion Picture and Television Commission lists 72 Hours among the state's 2025 feature productions, even though the story sells Miami as its world of heat, color, water, and temptation. At least part of that Miami identity, therefore, had to be manufactured through locations, design, framing, wardrobe, vehicles, and continuity. The illusion is pervasive because the movie does not map the city realistically. Miami functions as emotional geography, the place where Joe imagines adulthood can be posed and every polished surface promises reinvention. Knowing that some of this freedom was constructed elsewhere gives the images a fitting artificiality. Joe is also pretending to inhabit a world that is not fully his. The city he experiences and the person he performs are both assembled from selected angles. Finally, Tim Story publicly emphasized the chemistry among Hart, Hernandez, Gooding, Marshall, and Patterson when Netflix introduced the film. That promotional claim is easy to dismiss, but the finished work largely supports it. The film's most durable production achievement is not the scale of the party or the mechanics of the danger. It is the sense that these performers occasionally supplies one another. A reaction arrives half a beat differently than expected. A younger character refuses to become merely the target of Joe's confusion. A familiar heart routine is softened by someone responding with patience instead of panic. That is how the film was made in the deepest sense. An old comic engine was connected to a younger ensemble and asked to run without losing either identity. Sometimes the gears grind, sometimes the machine moves with real warmth. And now that we can see the hands that built it, we can look more closely at what the finished film actually achieves. The film's strongest achievement is that Joe gradually stops looking like the only person generating the comedy. Kevin Hart begins with his familiar arsenal: compressed impatience, defensive confidence, physical agitation, and a voice that rises whenever control begins slipping away. Joe can turn a simple objection into a full body argument. His eyes search for an exit while his mouth continues insisting that no exit is necessary. Hart has performed variations of this rhythm before, and 72 Hours knows that familiarity is part of the premise. Joe believes he is still the center of the cultural conversation, just as the movie knows Hart remains the largest presence in its cast. But the performance becomes more interesting when that certainty meets indifference. The younger men do not always react to Joe with the fear, admiration, or outrage his comic energy expect. Sometimes they simply watch him. Sometimes they answer his elaborate defense with a brief observation. That imbalance makes his desperation visible. He is throwing enormous emotional force into a room that no longer agrees to receive it on his terms. The clearest proof comes not from one of the film's largest stars, but from the quieter moment when Joe is asked to participate in the group's emotional honesty. The younger men have made a habit of checking in with one another, naming what they feel without immediately disguising it as a joke. Joe resists. His discomfort is not expressed through a speech about masculinity or age. It appears in the way he searches for humor, dismissal, and irritation, anything that will keep him from answering plainly. Hart lets the resistance become the performance. Joe behaves as though emotional clarity is an unreasonable demand because admitting otherwise would reveal how much he needs it. For a few seconds, the film stops asking Hart to accelerate and allows him to show a man whose entire personality has been constructed to prevent one honest sentence from escaping. That is where the character feels inhabited rather than merely delivered. The supporting performances create the conditions for that change. Mason Gooding plays the groom whose steadiness that broad comedy often forgets it needs. Mason is not the least funny person in the group because he is grounded. His calmness becomes a form of timing. He waits. He lets another character exhaust an excuse before responding. He looks at Joe as though he can already see the insecurity underneath the salesmanship. Official Netflix material describes Mason as the emotional foundation of the friendship, and Gooding plays him that way without turning him into a lecturer. He gives the weekend a future. The others may be trying to preserve an earlier version of themselves, but Mason is moving toward marriage with genuine anticipation rather than reluctant surrender. That confidence quietly challenges Joe more effectively than ridicule could. Marcello Hernandez gives Nick the opposite movement. Nick is constantly creating energy because silence might make the coming change feel real. His gestures arrive before his thoughts have settled. His enthusiasm for the party is sincere, but so is the anxiety buried inside it. Hernandez makes Nick's immaturity feel connected to affection. He is not afraid of marriage as an institution. He is afraid of losing daily access to the person who has helped define him. when Nick jokes at Mason's expense, the humor frequently contains a small act of bargaining. Remember who we were, remain who we were, do not let the ceremony prove that the old life has ended. Hernandez does not always receive enough dramatic space, but he gives the character a recognizable emotional logic. Ben Marsh's Hunter may be the ensemble's most unexpectedly effective comic presence. The character enters the weekend emotionally exposed, carrying the aftermath of a breakup into a celebration of commitment. Marshall refuses to play that sadness as dignified suffering. Hunter's feelings keep spilling into spaces that have no room for them. His heartbreak becomes inconvenient, repetitive, and therefore human. The Associated Press singled out Marshall's performance among the younger cast, and it is easy to see why. His looseness changes the texture of scenes that might otherwise become rigid exchanges between Hart and a collection of generational stereotypes. Hunter can derail a conversion without appearing to force the derailment. His sadness has its own strange momentum. Cam Patterson brings another form of comic openness to Freshman. His little responses could have reduced him to a repeated mechanism, but Patterson often makes the pauses more important than the punchlines. Freshman considers statements that everyone else instantly recognizes as absurd. He gives them the dignity of thought. That sincerity becomes funny because the world around him has forgotten how to receive anything without irony. Together, the younger cast gives the friendship a sense of internal weather. Their chemistry was emphasized by Tim Story and the performers in Netflix's promotional material, which also notes that Story welcomed improvisation and ideas about how the actors could bring more of themselves into the characters. Whatever was scripted and whatever emerged on set, the finished interactions often feel least manufactured when the group is simply talking over, around, and through Joe. The screenplay's best idea is not the criminal complication or the accumulation of party disasters. It is the contrast between emotional intelligence and cultural sophistication. Joe knows how to sell an image of youth, but he does not know how to sit comfortably with vulnerability. The younger men use language he sometimes finds excessive or unfamiliar, yet they understand one another's emotional states more directly than he understands his own. The generational joke therefore bends back on itself. The supposedly experienced man has professional fluency but limited emotional vocabulary. The supposedly unserious man possesses a practice of care he has never learned. The physical scrapbook concentrates that idea into one object. In a film built around phones, hidden recordings, and content that can be collected without permission, the scrapbook carries the weight of deliberate memory. Its pages are imperfect, material, and shared. The images do not exist to reach strangers, they exist to preserve meaning among friends. That makes Joe's secret footage more than a plot device. It becomes the screenplay's moral contrast, both the footage and the scrapbook record experience, but only one respects the people inside it. One says that a moment has value because it can be sold. The other says it has value because it was lived together. Visually, 72 Hours is not searching for ambiguity, it uses space in direct emotional ways. The office contains two, within clean professional lines. Miami opens the frame through water, rooftops, vehicles, bright interiors, and crowded party spaces. The expansion creates an illusion of liberation, but Joe rarely looks free inside it. He is frequently squeezed by bodies, trapped by movement, or isolated within a wide environment he cannot command. The visual language is most effective when scale becomes the joke. Joe tries to project authority while the yacht, the city, and the consequences around him keep growing larger. His body becomes a small, frantic point inside spaces designed to advertise excess. The environment does not merely host his insecurity, it enlarges it. Story's camera generally favors clarity over invention. The setups allow performances and reactions to remain legible, which suits an ensemble comedy. Yet the most expressive images are often the simplest. The group arranged together while Joe stands slightly outside their rhythm, the scrapbook held between friends, or a phone positioned close enough to remind us that a private experience is being converted into something else. Sound performs a similar function. The party music supplies momentum, but its constant promise of pleasure becomes exhausting by design. Each new burst of music tells Joe that the weekend is still moving and therefore that his deception has not yet got him. When the soundtrack recedes, the film becomes more emotionally alert. Silence is not sustained for long, but its reality gives it weight. A pause after a joke allows embarrassment to emerge. A break in the group's noise reveals that someone has been hurt. The phone vibration, so small beside the film's music and shouting, remains the most consequential sound because it begins everything without demanding attention. By this point, it no longer sounds like possibility or pressure alone. It sounds like a question. When every performance is finished, every image is collected, and every room finally becomes quieted, will Joe know how to answer without trying to sell something? That question is where the film's achievements lead us, toward the language it discovers whenever words briefly stop protecting its characters. But silence is difficult to find in 72 hours. This is a film of vibrating phones, overlapping voices, engines, music, arguments, and bodies crashing through spaces too small to contain them. Joe responds to nearly every uncomfortable feeling by producing more sound. He explains, exaggerates, negotiates, complains, and performs. Even when nobody has accused him of anything, he speaks like a man delivering his closing defense. The absence of silence is therefore meaningful before silence itself ever arrives. Joe's noise functions as camouflage. If he keeps the conversation moving, nobody can examine why he is there. If he turns embarrassment into comedy quickly enough, perhaps it will never become shame. If he fills every pause with confidence, perhaps nobody will hear the uncertainty underneath it. The younger men possess a different relationship with quiet. Before surrendering themselves to the bachelor party chaos, they pause for an emotional check in. The ritual surprises Joe because it refuses the rhythm he understands. Nobody is selling an idea. Nobody is attempting to win. They are simply creating enough space for each person to say what he is carrying. The film establishes this practice alongside their physical scrapbook, making both gestures part of a friendship built through deliberate attention rather than constant digital performance. Joe initially treats the check-in as something faintly absurd. His reaction tells us more than any explanation could. The camera does not need to reveal a hidden childhood wound or supply a dramatic monologue about why he avoids vulnerability. His resistance is visible in the speed with which he looks for an escape. He appears more comfortable entering a dangerous situation than entering an honest pause. That is what this film understands about silence at its best. Quiet can feel threatening when a person has constructed an identity through performance. The group does not demand that Joe become younger, it asks him to become present. He can imitate language, study habits, purchase access, and memorize the surface of another generation, but he cannot counterfeit presence. Presence begins when he stops deciding how a moment might be useful. The hidden recording device complicates every pause. It means the group is never as alone as it believes. Even in a room occupied only by friends, an unseen audience has already entered. Their gestures are being collected for a campaign. Their affection is being transformed into material. What the film chooses not to show in those moments matters. We do not see a vast digital audience responding to the footage. We do not need focus groups, engagement statistics, or a completed advertisement to understand the violation. The emotional damage exists before the material is published. It begins when Joe looks at a private moment and sees a resource. The scrapbook again becomes the film's quietest counter image. Its pages cannot vibrate or alert anyone, they wait to be opened. A photograph remains still long enough for memory to gather around it. The object asks nothing from strangers and does not measure whether its images are popular. Its meaning belongs to the people who made it. Cinema rarely does this in a broad party comedy, places its most important moral distinction between two ways of recording the same life. One method captures people without truly seeing them. The other remembers them because they were seen. The film's camera is not consistently patient enough to deepen this contrast. Tim's story generally prioritizes clear reactions and comic momentum, and several moments that might have benefited from stillness are interrupted by another joke or complication. Some critics found that the attempted emotional grounding never became fully convincing, while others recognized a more reflective midlife anxiety beneath the film's frantic surface. That limitation becomes part of the experience. 72 Hours understands that Joe must eventually become quiet, but it does not always trust quiet enough to let us remain there with him. The movie frequently approaches emotional exposure and then rescues the character with movement. A pause begins, a joke arrives, the mask slips, the plot pulls it back into place. Still, brief fractures remain. There are moments when Mason looks at Joe without immediately answering him. That look creates an empty space Joe cannot control. Mason's calmness becomes more confronting than anger because it refuses to participate in Joe's performance. He does not need to defeat Joe's argument. He only needs to wait long enough for the argument to reveal itself as fear. There are also small changes in the group's arrangement. Early on, Joe appears attached to them through money and momentum, always slightly outside the invisible geometry of their friendship. Later, the space between bodies narrows. Acceptance is communicated not through a declaration but through where he is allowed to stand, sit, and remain when the entertainment stops. Visual restraint appears most clearly when the film lets an object hold the emotional weight that dialogue would usually carry. A phone line still can represent a lie waiting to awaken. A scrapbook in someone's hands can represent years of friendship. An empty space beside a person can reveal who is missing or who has not yet decided to stay. The phone vibration has now traveled from invitation to pressure, from pressure to evidence, and from evidence to interruption. Every time it sounds, it prevents the present from being complete. It reminds Joe of the campaign, the office, and the concealed reason he entered this friendship. The most important silence will therefore not be the absence of music. It will be the moment when Joe can no longer answer that vibration without hearing what it has cost him. Until then, the film keeps talking, and sometimes its inability to remain quiet reveals exactly where it falls short. The film's first real weakness is that it recognizes Joe's silence without being willing to remain inside it. Whenever the character approaches genuine self awareness, another complication arrives to protect him from the discomfort. A joke interrupts the pause, a physical disaster changes the subject. The criminal plot drags the group into another room before the emotional consequences of the previous one have settled. The movie understands that Joe's constant motion is an avoidance mechanism, but it often adopts the same mechanism itself. This creates a pacing problem that is not simply about speed. Fast comedy can be beautifully controlled. A farce can move with such precision that every new disaster feels inevitable. 72 Hours moves quickly, but its events do not always build upon one another with that kind of discipline. Solo sequences feel attached rather than developed, as though the screenplay keeps adding pressure without deciding which pressure matters most. The stolen scrapbook could have carried the second half by itself. It connects directly to the friendship, Joe's hidden recordings, and the contrast between memory created with affection and content gathered for profit. The women who robbed the group could also have become meaningful opponents, people who recognize the men's vanity and use it against them. Instead, that Sterling competes with an underworld misunderstanding, a hidden criminal operation, Joel's exaggerated alter ego, and other details that pull attention away from the film's strongest emotional objects. The danger grows, but the meaning becomes less concentrated. Several critics similarly identified a lack of narrative economy and an overloaded structure, with Roger.com noting that the film's potentially reflective midlife material is surrounded by slapstick and uneven plotting. The Guardian argued that the younger ensemble and the robbery storyline offered richer possibilities than the direction the screenplay ultimately chose. The younger characters also remain caught between being individuals and representatives of a generation. Mason has a clear emotional function as the groom moving confidently toward change. Nick fears losing the friendship that formed him. Hunter carries romantic pain, and Freshman offers an unguarded sincerity. These are useful foundations, but the field rarely gives them enough private space to become fully dimensional. We learn how they relate to Joe, yet less about how they understand themselves when he is not present. That imbalance weakens the generational theme. Joe is allowed to be contradictory, selfish but lonely, manipulative but affectionate, professionally successful but emotionally stalled. The younger men are often asked to embody lessons he needs to learn. Their emotional intelligence becomes admirable, but sometimes too convenient. The film says they should not be reduced to a marketing category, while occasionally using them as a corrective category within Joe's development. The comedy itself has a similar inconsistency. Some jokes grow naturally from character. Joe misunderstanding the group's rituals, Hunter's sadness appealing at inappropriate moments, or Freshman taking an absurd statement seriously. These moments work because the laughter reveals personality. Other jokes rely on repetition, crude escalation, or caricature without uncovering anything new. The louder Joe becomes, the more the film occasionally mistakes volume for momentum. Certain cultural impersonations and stereotypes are acknowledged as inappropriate inside the story, but recognition does not automatically transform them into sharper satire. The scene must still offer more than the outdated behavior it claims to expose. Several reviews criticize this dependence on familiar caricature and recycled comic habits. This is a real one rather than minor texture because the entire film is supposedly asking whether Joe and perhaps the comedy surrounding him can change. When the screenplay falls back on the same instincts it associates with his obsolescence, the critic becomes confused. Is the joke on Joe, or is the film simply using Joe to repeat the joke? Jennifer is another missed source of depth. Her career opportunity and frustration with Joe's emotional hesitation give the story stakes beyond the weekend. She represents the adult life Joe already possesses but has failed to value because it does not make him feel newly admired. Yet she remains distant for much of the film, functioning more as a future he might lose than as a fully present participant in the relationship. More time with Jennifer would have clarified what Joe's avoidance costs another person. Without it, his eventual growth risks feeling like a lesson completed during one chaotic weekend rather than the beginning of difficult repair. Even the visual construction sometimes settles for functional coverage. The bright locations, crowded frames, and expensive surfaces communicate excess clearly, but the editing can become abrupt enough to weaken the rhythm between setup and reaction. RogerEbert.com specifically criticized portions of the editing, and broader critical consensus has frequently described the film as confusing chaos with comic precision. Still, these failures are frustrating because the stronger film remains visible underneath them. It is there in the scrapbook. It is there in Mason's calm certainty. It is there whenever Joe stops performing long enough to understand that youth cannot be harvested, purchased, or replayed through hidden footage. The phone keeps vibrating, but the screenplay answers to many of its calls. It follows every new interruption instead of trusting the quieter story already waiting on the line. And that quieter story is what the film is really trying to say. The quieter story waiting on the line is not really about whether Joe can understand a younger generation. It is about whether he can stop treating understanding as possession. From the moment he enters the group chat, Joe assumes that relevance is something outside himself, guarded by younger people and available to anyone clever enough to study their behavior. He approaches their language like a code, their friendship like a campaign brief, and their weekend like raw material. He believes that if he can identify the correct references, gestures, and attitudes, he can return to work carrying youth inside a presentation. But culture does not work that way. You can imitate its vocabulary without understanding the needs beneath. You can reproduce its appearance while missing the reason it feels alive. Joe's professional mistake is also his emotional mistake. He confuses observing people with knowing them. That is what the hidden footage means. The camera records surfaces perfectly. It captures movement, clothing, jokes, intoxication, and spontaneous reactions. Yet it cannot explain why Nick is frightened of Mason's marriage, why Hunter's sadness keeps escaping at inconvenient moments, or why the scrapbook matters more than the expensive objects surrounding it. The footage contains everything Joe thought he needed and almost nothing that would allow him to understand the people inside it. The film is therefore asking a simple but uncomfortable question. How often do we collect proof of an experience instead of experiencing it? A phone can preserve the face of someone beloved while distracting us from the expression currently passing across it. A photograph can become evidence that we attended a place without proving that we were emotionally present there. A conversation can be translated into content before we have decided what it meant. 72 Hours does not reject technology. Each story could not begin without it. The accidental message creates a connection that would otherwise have been impossible, and the group chat is also an extension of genuine friendship. The problem is not the device. The problem is the intention held by the person using it. For the younger men, the phone is often connective tissue. For Joe, it becomes an extraction tool. This distinction gives the vibrating phone its deepest meaning, yet it begins as an external call, but it gradually reveals an internal habit. Joe has trained himself to respond whenever the word offers measurable approval. A promotion, a successful campaign, a younger person's laughter, or a new message can briefly assure him that he still matters. He is not addicted to the phone itself. He is dependent on being confirmed by something outside himself. That is why his stable life feels strangely insufficient. Jennifer loves him, but lasting love no longer produces the thrill of discovery. His career has already rewarded him, but previous achievement cannot silence present insecurity. He has reached an age when accomplishment is supposed to create peace, yet he experiences it as a demand to prove that accomplishment was not temporary. The film understands something painful here. Growing older does not always frighten us because of physical change. Sometimes it frightens us because the world stops introducing us as potential. When you are young, the future appears to contain countless identities. Every invitation might reveal another version of you. With age, choices accumulate, a career becomes specific, a relationship becomes real. The life you built begins closing the doors of lives you did not build. Joe does not enter the bachelor party because he truly wants to become 25 again. He enters because those men still seem surrounded by possibility. Their plans are unfinished. Their friendships are changing. Their mistakes have not yet hardened into permanent definitions. Standing beside them allows Joe to imagine that his own life remains similarly open. Mason complicates that fantasy because he chooses commitment without appearing diminished by it. To Joe, adulthood has become a room with narrowing walls. To Mason, commitment is not the death of possibility but the decision to give possibility a direction. He is not surrendering every future. He is selecting one with intention. Nick cannot yet see that. He hears marriage as an ending because he believes friendship can remain safe only if its circumstances remain unchanged. His fear mirrors Joe's more closely than either man realizes. Both mistake change for disappearance. Joe believes aging will erase the person he was. Nick believes marriage will erase the friendship he knew. The weekend places those fears beside each other and slowly reveals their shared error. What matters does not survive by remaining untouched. It survives by changing without losing its emotional truth. That is why the scrapbook is so important. Its pages freeze individual moments, but the object itself continues growing. Each image records a version of the group that no longer exists exactly as it did. Different clothes, different relationships, different stages of life. The book does not deny change. It gives change continuity. The friendship is not valuable because Mason and Nick can remain young together forever. It is valuable because their past can accompany them into forms they have not yet learned to imagine. Drew needs the same lesson. His experience is not a burden preventing him from understanding younger people. It becomes a burden only when he uses it to defend himself from them. Age can create rigidity, but it can also create perspective. It can make someone protective of an old identity or generous with what time has taught them. The film is strongest whenever Joe stops trying to perform youth and begins offering experience without demanding authority in return. In those moments, the generational divide becomes less significant. He does not need to know every phrase or imitate every behavior. He needs to recognize fear, affection, loneliness, and loyalty, the emotional languages that do not belong to one age group. The official premise frames Joe as a 40-year-old executive attempting to understand Gen Z by joining their Miami bachelor party. While several reviews have noted the story's self-aware connection between Joe's professional anxiety and Kevin Hart's established comic persona, but the film's better idea is that relevance cannot be secured through imitation. It emerges from responsiveness, the ability to listen when the world changes without assuming that change is an accusation. Think about what that means beyond this weekend. Every generation eventually becomes the older generation. Every form of rebellion develops habits. Every new language begins aging as soon as people learn to speak it. The question is not whether you can remain permanently current. You cannot. The question is whether becoming less current must also mean becoming less curious. Joe's crisis begins because he interprets unfamiliarity as humiliation. If he does not understand something immediately, he feels displaced by it. So he responds by pretending, controlling, or dismissing. Curiosity would require a different posture. It would require him to admit that another person knows something he does not. That admission is not defeat, it is connection. The younger men also learned that openness does not make experience irrelevant. Their emotional vocabulary helps Joe, but his years allow him to recognize consequences they sometimes ignore. The film does not need one generation to defeat the other. It needs them to stop approaching one another as competing definitions of how a person should live. This is why the movie's flaws do not erase its central feeling. The plot becomes excessive, the comedy sometimes retreats into habits it should interrogate, and the supporting characters deserve greater depth. Yet underneath all of that is an honest recognition that people often seek youth when what they really seek is permission to change. Joe does not need another beginning. He needs to stop treating the life he already has as though it were ending. And the foam, which once seemed to summon him toward a more exciting identity, begins to lose its authority. Its vibration can still interrupt the room, but it can no longer decide what the room means. For the first time, Joe is approaching a choice the screen cannot make for him. He can protect the image he has collected, or he can protect the people who trusted him enough to appear inside it. That choice between the image and the people inside it belongs naturally within Tim Story's cinema, because his films repeatedly begin with characters who believe control will earn them belonging. In Barbershop, a place of business becomes a community only when the people inside it stop behaving like customers and owners and begin revealing what they mean to one another. In Think Like a Man, relationships are initially approached through strategies, categories, and rules, only for those systems to break down when real feeling refuses to follow instructions. In Ride Along, a man attempts to prove his worth by entering another person's professional world and performing an identity he has not yet earned. Even Story's superhero work is built around incompatible personalities being forced to discover whether difference can become cooperation. The genres change, but the recurring dramatic engine remains recognizable. Someone enters a group with an idea of who they must appear to be, and comedy strips that performance away. 72 Hours fits this pattern almost perfectly. Joe enters the bachelor party as a manufactured version of himself. He wants to be the experienced stranger who can pay for everything, survive anything, and translate youth into professional advantage. He believes belonging can be accelerated through spectacle. Story surrounds him with a group whose connection cannot be purchased because it was built through shared time. This is also why Story often favors ensembles over solitary comic portraits. His characters become legible through collision. One personality creates pressure, another resists it, and a third reveals what both are refusing to say. In a 2014 interview about Think Like a Man 2, Story described looking for new combinations within a large cast and treating character chemistry as the foundation that allows a familiar story to grow. He also explains that he gives performers room to improvise while keeping those additions directed toward the story. You can feel that instinct throughout 72 hours. The film is not framed around the idea that Joe alone possesses comic truth. His speed needs Mason's stillness. Nick's anxious enthusiasm exposes Joe's own fear of change. Hunter's emotional overflow then turned Minity into something Joe can no longer dismiss as weakness. Freshman's sincerity makes Joe's strategic thinking look needlessly complicated. Story's signature is not visual severity or formal distance. He tends to make accessible, performance-led entertainment in which the camera protects the chemistry of the cast. The images are usually clear enough for us to register who controls the room, who has lost control, and whose reaction quietly changes the meaning of the joke. That clarity can be a strength. It allows performers with different rhythms to coexist without being forced into identical timing. Netflix's official material for 72 Hours quotes Mason Gooding and Ben Marshall describing Story as collaborative, trusting, and open to improvisation, and actors supplied ideas. The finished film supports that description most clearly when the younger ensemble seems to loosen the structure around Hart rather than merely wait for him to finish. But the same signature creates the film's limitation. Story is skilled at sustaining motion, chemistry, and broad tonal accessibility. He is less committed here to the uncomfortable stillness that Joe's inner crisis requires. His filmmaking often seeks the moment when conflicting personalities can become a functioning unit. 72 hours sometimes reaches that reconciliation too quickly, smoothing the emotional aberration before it has fully marked the characters. This makes the film a continuation rather than a departure. It returns story to several familiar elements, Kevin Hart as a man overestimating his control, an ensemble from sharply contrasting energies, a celebration threatened by escalating disorder, and a relationship problem expressed into comic spectacle. Netflix itself identifies Barbershop, Think Like a Man, and Ride Along as key points of reference when introducing Story as the film's director. Yet the generational divide gives those instincts a newer emotional pressure. Earlier story protagonists often needed to prove that they deserved entry into a family, profession, or relationship. Joe has already achieved entry into adult life. His problem is that he cannot accept the identity waiting for him there. That distinction teaches us something about how story sees the world. His cinema repeatedly treats identity as social rather than private. You learn who you are to the people who refuse your performance, challenge your assumptions, and eventually make room for the more honest version underneath. The group is not merely where humiliation happens, it is where transformation becomes possible. And so the form's vibration changes once more. Under another filmmaker, it might remain a symbol of technological alienation. Under story, it becomes the signal that throws one incompatible personality into an ensemble and waits for chemistry to break his defenses. The invitation was accidental. The collision belongs entirely to the filmmaker. Once you know that Joe's invitation will become a test of trust, the opening vibration no longer sounds innocent. On a first viewing, the accidental group chat message feels like the mechanism required to begin the comedy. It is the unlikely coincidence that pushes an established advertising executive into a Miami bachelor party with four younger strangers. On a second viewing, the coincidence matters less than the speed of Joe's response. He barely needs to be tempted. The message does not create his dissatisfaction, it discovers dissatisfaction already waiting for permission. That changes the early office scenes. Joe's outdated campaign ideas may initially seem like a straightforward setup for a generational comedy. Watching again, you notice how personally he receives every professional objection. He does not hear that one idea has failed. He hears that the identity attached to all his earlier successes may be losing value. His defensiveness is therefore not only arrogance, it is foreshadowing. The same instinct that makes him protect a weak campaign will later make him protect a larger deception. Whenever evidence threatens the image he has created, Joe's first response is not curiosity but performance. He speaks faster, argues harder, and invents another version of events in which he remains in control. The bachelor party chat also feels different once you understand what the friendship means to Mason, Nick, Hunter, and Freshman. On first contact, their messages appear to Joe as a sample of Gen Z behavior. On rewatch, they become evidence of an established emotional ecosystem. The private jokes, unpolished enthusiasm, and casual check-ins are not random cultural details waiting to be decoded. They are the language of people who already know one another. Joe mistakes intimacy for information. That error is visible before he ever arrives in Miami. His generosity gains a darker edge as well. The upgraded accommodation, the endless supply of branded alcohol, and his willingness to finance the weekend can initially make him seem like an intrusive but useful stranger. Once you know his professional motive, every gift becomes part of an unstated transaction. He is not asking the men to sell him their trust because he knows they would never agree to the price. Yet the reward does not make Joe simply less sympathetic. It makes his gradual affection easier to see. There are small moments when his attention stops behaving like research. He responds to Nick's anxiety rather than merely observing it. He recognizes the sadness Hunter cannot contain. He begins watching Mason with the admiration of someone encountering a form of commitment he has repeatedly postponed in his own life. The change is not announced because Joe himself does not immediately recognize it. His motive evolves before his behavior catches up. He begins caring about the group while continuing to record them, and that contradiction gives the middle of the film more emotional weight the second time. The scrapbook becomes more powerful for the same reason. On first viewing, it is a warm character detail and eventually an object important enough to drive the man forward. On rewatch, it has been arguing with Joe's hidden footage from the moment it appears. Both preserve images, but only one was created by the people whose lives it contains. One is memory shaped through participation. The other is material gathered through concealment. Its physical form matters too. The pages have to be held. The photographs remain beside one another rather than disappearing into an endless feed. Time accumulates visibly. Mason's marriage will change the friendship, but the scrapbook proves that change has already been happening for years without destroying what connects them. Nick's behavior becomes sadder once that is clear. His excess is not merely the expected recklessness of a best man. It is an attempt to create one final page before the group enters a future he cannot control. He treats the weekend as though intensity might prevent transition. Joe is doing the same thing on a larger scale. He believes 72 extraordinary hours can protect him from aging, professional uncertainty, and the decision waiting in his relationship with Jennifer. Nick believes those hours can protect his friendship from Mason's marriage. Both men pursue chaos because ordinary time is moving in a direction they have not accepted. Even the criminal detours appear differently on rewatch. The local danger initially seems to arrive from a separate, more exaggerated film, including Joe's absurd transformation into a would-be gangster persona and the misunderstanding that places the group in escalating jeopardy. But that persona is another version of the mask Joe has worn from the beginning. In the office he performs certainty, with the younger men he performs relevance. Under threat he performs invincibility. The genre changes around him, but his emotional method remains the same. The film gains some power on rewatch because surprise is not its strongest resource. Its plot is too familiar and too loosely assembled for revelation alone to carry the experience. Several critics have compared its bachelor-party structure and criminal escalation to earlier studio comedies, particularly The Hangover. What improves is the pattern underneath the plot. You begin noticing how often Joe records instead of listening, how frequently Nick jokes before admitting fear, and how Mason's calmness quietly exposes both men. The phone vibration becomes less a cause than a recurring reminder that each character is being asked whether he will answer change with attention or avoidance. The second viewing cannot repair every theme character or uneven detour. Some jokes become weaker once their shock is gone, and the overloaded plot remains overloaded. But the emotional tools become clearer. Joe was never searching for youth. Nick was never protecting a party. Both were asking time not to move until they felt ready. And time, like the phone in Joe's hand, had already begun vibrating. Long before Joe's phone vibrated, the bachelor party comedy had already developed its own cinematic language. The clock is short. The city promises temporary freedom. One friend is about to enter marriage, and everyone around him behaves as though adulthood can be delayed by creating enough disorder. Respectable identities disappear beneath alcohol, humiliation, damaged property, dangerous strangers, and decisions that would be impossible to defend in daylight. In that tradition, the party is rarely only a celebration, it is a final argument with change. The most visible film standing behind 72 Hours is The Hangover. Critics from the Associated Press, Variety, and Roger.com all identified the resemblance, with the AP describing 72 Hours as a highly engineered comedy whose scenes repeatedly recall earlier films, especially Todd Phillips' 2009 Bachelor Party hit. The connection is not hidden. A group travels to a glamorous party city. A wedding creates a deadline. Intoxication opens the door to criminal danger. A night designed to strengthen friendship instead exposes every weakness inside it. Each new attempt to regain control produces a larger problem, but The Hangover builds its comedy around absence. Its characters wake after the central night and must reconstruct what they have done. The missing memory turns the city into a puzzle, with each absurd discovery revealing another fragment of their unobserved selves. 72 hours builds around a different kind of absence. Joe remembers what he's doing. What he lacks is honest awareness of why he's doing it. The mystery is not what happened during the weekend. It is why a successful man would risk his career, relationship, and dignity to remain near people whose approval should not define him. The earlier film asks its characters to recover lost time. This one asks Joe to recognize that he is afraid of time continuing. That difference could have allowed 72 hours to transform the bachelor party structure more completely. The group chat replaces the accidental encounter. Hidden recordings replace missing photographs as the morally significant images. Generational identity replaces bachelorhood as the primary source of anxiety. Yet the film often trusts inherited chaos more than its new emotional idea. Instead of allowing the conflict over relevance, consent, and friendship to deepen, it repeatedly returns to the familiar belief that a comedy becomes larger when criminal danger enters it. The result joins the conversation with the hangover without fully escaping its shadow. Another film enters much more directly. When Joe adopts the persona of Ricardo Montana, he is performing an exaggerated imitation of Tony Montana from Brian De Palma's Scarface. The name, accent, Miami setting, and sudden criminal misunderstanding turn one of cinema's most recognizable gangster figures into a broad comic mask. Reviews consistently identified the sequence as an explicit Scarface parody. This reference is not merely decoration. Tony Montana has endured in popular culture as an image of absolute ambition, the outsider who enters a glamorous criminal world and tries to become larger than every room containing him. Joe's version is deliberately pathetic. He borrows the voice of cinematic power precisely when he has never possessed less control. The parody therefore reflects the film's central behavior. Joe keeps borrowing images because he does not trust the person beneath him. He performs the successful executive, the generous older friend, the man who understands youth, and finally the fearless gangster. Each identity comes from somewhere outside him. Even at his most outrageous, he is quoting another version of masculinity. What 72 hours adds to this cinematic inheritance is the anxiety of being recorded while performing those identities. Earlier party comedies often ended with photographs revealing what happened after memory disappeared. Here, images are being gathered intentionally and secretly while the weekend is still unfolding. The camera is no longer only evidence of chaos, it becomes part of the betrayal. That is the film's genuinely contemporary contribution. The bachelor party once offered temporary escape from ordinary identity. In 72 hours, escape is nearly impossible because every performance can be captured, repackaged, and shown to people who are never present. Joe enters the weekend hoping to become relevant through observation, only to discover that observation without care can destroy the connection it claims to understand. The cinema before this film gave it the Lost Weekend, the male ensemble, the wedding deadline, the dangerous misunderstanding, and the Miami gangster fantasy. What this film tries to give back is a question those earlier comedies did not need to ask with the same urgency. What happens when the wild weekend is no longer allowed to disappear? The phone has remembered everything. Now the people inside those images must decide what that memory means. From this moment, we go into full spoilers. If you have not yet seen this film, stop here. Go experience it first and come back. Some things deserve to be felt before they are understood. The truth finally reaches the group through the device that began everything. Joe's wearable camera has not merely captured the public chaos of the weekend, it has preserved private confessions, emotional arguments, and moments of vulnerability that the men offered because they believed they were among friends. Once they discover that he entered their lives as an advertising executive gathering material for a campaign, every generous act changes meaning. The house was not hospitality. The alcohol was not generosity. The listening was not innocent. Even the moments in which Joe genuinely cared for them become difficult to separate from the deception surrounding them. This is why the exposure hurts more than a conventional reveal about someone lying to join a party. Joe has not only hidden who he is, he has altered the meaning of their memories. The scrapbook is already missing after the group is drugged and robbed, and Joe tries to retrieve it as an act of repair. Recovering it will not erase the footage, but it represents the first thing he does for the group that offers him no professional return. He is finally protecting a record of their friendship rather than manufacturing one of his own. Before he can make that repair complete, Mason is kidnapped. The criminal plot that has been circling the weekend now closes around the group. During the yacht chaos, they unknowingly became connected to a missing cocaine shipment concealed in the jet skis they took. Chase and his father interpret Joe's stolen badge, false confidence, and Ricardo Montana performance as evidence that he is something far more dangerous than a frightened advertising executive improvising his way through disaster. The ridiculous persona Joe created to survive one moment has become a reputation he can no longer control. That is the hidden logic beneath the film's bilister. Joe has spent the entire weekend constructing images of himself. No strangers believe one of them. He wanted the younger men to see a wealthy, fearless insider. He wanted his employers to see someone who could still translate youth into profit. He wanted Jennifer to believe that their relationship could remain indefinitely suspended without consequence. Ricardo Montana is only the most exaggerated version of a habit he has practiced throughout the film, creating a character whenever the truth feels insufficient. The final confrontation forces him to abandon that method. Mason's life cannot be protected by a sales pitch. The group cannot be reunited through another performance. Joe must rely on Nick, Hunter, Freshman, and the very emotional honesty he initially mocked. The men work together after trust has been broken, not because the betrayal has stopped mattering, but because friendship sometimes requires action before forgiveness is ready. The appearance of Jazz's father, played by Andy Garcia, pushes the criminal absurdity toward its final extreme. Yet beneath the comedy is an unexpectedly useful reflection of Joe. The drug lord is also a man attempting to maintain authority through performance. While carrying emotions his role does not comfortably permit. The film turns the supposed final threat into another figure whose hardened identity cannot completely conceal a need to be understood. Netflix's official ending summary describes the climax as a showdown involving a surprisingly sensitive drug lord, after which Joe's new friendships are solidified. The danger passes, but Joe's real test begins when the noise ends. He returns to Jennifer and finds that her life is no longer waiting patiently for his decision. She has been prepared to move forward without him. The packed possibility of departure makes visible what Joe has refused to understand. Postponement is still a choice. And refusing to choose someone eventually gives that person a reason to choose a life without you. Joe proposes. The gesture is conventional, but its meaning comes from Mason's influence. At the beginning, Joe saw marriage and professional aging as versions of the same enclosure. Commitment seemed to close possibilities. After 72 hours beside a groom who approaches marriage without mourning his freedom, Joe understands that choosing a future does not make life smaller, it gives life a direction. He is not proposing because the weekend has made him young again. He is proposing because it has made avoidance feel old. The professional resolution completes the same transformation. Joe does not simply return to his former office carrying stolen insight and receive the promotion he originally wanted. He starts his own advertising business. Nick joins him and helps secure a major campaign, turning their generational exchange into an actual collaboration rather than an older executive extracting value from a younger demographic. This outcome matters because Joe gives up the institution whose approval drove his deception. He begins the film asking whether an established company still considers him relevant. He ends it creating a place where relevance can emerge through partnership. 3 weeks later, the characters reunite for Mason and Emily's wedding. Jennifer's engagement ring confirms that Joe has finally made his own commitment. Mason appears more at ease. Nick now has a place inside Joe's new professional life, and the weekend's accidental group has become a real friendship. Then the film returns to the emotional check-in Joe once resisted. This time, he leads it. Mason identifies himself through the marriage he has chosen. Nick speaks from the security of employment and continued friendship. Hunter is emerging from the sadness that followed his broken engagement. Freshman offers another characteristically unexpected answer. Joe looks ahead toward a bachelor party of his own. The ritual has not changed. Joe has. At first, he considered emotional language a strange habit belonging to younger men. Now he understands it as a practice of presence. He is no longer collecting their answers for a campaign. He is participating because the answers matter. The closing joke has Joe admit the humiliating truth about what happened to his clothes during the weekend. It is deliberately undignified, but it completes the character more honestly than a triumphant professional speech could. Joe finally reveals something that cannot improve his image, increase his authority, or be turned into a marketable version of himself, and the group accepts him. The film reportedly includes a mid-credit scene and blooper material rather than using the credits to establish a major sequel mystery. Its function is therefore less about extending the plot than preserving the loose improvisational edge of the ensemble after the formal story has closed. There is no final notification summoning Joe toward another identity. The phone has lost its power because he no longer needs an accidental invitation to prove that he belongs somewhere. He has chosen Jennifer, built a new professional path, and earned a place within the friendship only after surrendering the false version of himself that first entered it. The ending is broad, rushed, and more forgiving than Joe's betrayal may deserve. Yet its emotional direction is right. He begins by secretly recording people because he believes their lives can save his image. He ends by telling them a truth that makes his image impossible to save. For once, nothing is being sold. And that may be the first moment in all 72 hours when Joe is completely present. What remains with me is not the yacht, the criminal misunderstanding, or even the moment Joe's deception is exposed. It is the final emotional check-in. The scene is small enough to disappear beneath the film's now dumb memories. The danger has ended. The wedding has arrived. Everyone has moved forward just enough for the weekend to begin turning into a story they will tell differently over time. Then Joe participates in the ritual he once treated as embarrassing. That change matters because it cannot be measured. His new company can be called success. His engagement can be displayed. The friendship can be photographed. But the ability to sit among other people and speak without hiding behind a performance is quieter. Nobody outside the circle needs to witness it. Joe begins the film believing that relevance means being seen by as many people as possible. He ends it discovering that belonging may mean being known by only a few. That is what I keep returning to. The film does not earn every part of this transformation equally. Its resolution arrives quickly, and forgiveness comes more easily than Joe's betrayal deserves. Yet the emotional destination remains true. A person can spend years building a voice that commands rooms and still have no language for what he feels when the room becomes quiet. Would I return to 72 hours? Perhaps not for the plot, which becomes more tangled than its ideas require. I would return for the ensemble's warmth, for the contrast between the hidden footage and the scrapbook, and for those brief moments when Kevin Hart allows Joe's momentum to collapse into uncertainty. The people most likely to carry this film with them are not necessarily those searching for the wildest bachelor party comedy. They are the ones who recognize the exhaustion of constantly proving they are still current. They know that strange moment when younger people appear to inhabit a world moving at a different speed, and when experience begins feeling less like a gift than evidence that time has passed. The phone's vibration has followed us through the entire film. At first, Joe answers because he wants another life. By the end, he no longer needs the screen to tell him where he belongs. He can finally look up. Taken as a complete experience, 72 Hours is a comedy with a better emotional idea than its construction consistently knows how to serve. It wants to be loud, reckless, and immediately entertaining. It wants the speed of a party movie, the danger of a criminal farce, and the familiarity of Kevin Hart fighting to remain in control while the world around him becomes increasingly impossible. Sometimes that machinery works. The ensemble finds a loose warmth, the physical comedy lands, and the contrast between Joe's defensive intensity and the younger men's emotional openness creates moments that feel genuinely alive. But the film also understands something more vulnerable than its loudest scenes suggest. It understands the fear of becoming outdated while you are still capable, still ambitious, and still unsure whether the world has simply changed its language without telling you. It understands how easily curiosity can become imitation and how quickly admiration can become extraction. Most importantly, it understands that trying to remain relevant can prevent you from being present. That idea lives most clearly in the distance between the phone and the scrapbook. The phone gives Joe access, information, footage, and the illusion of control. The scrapbook carries affection, shared history, and memories that have value without needing to reach anyone outside the friendship. One is always ready to interrupt. The other waits patiently to be opened. The film could have trusted that contrast more. It could have removed several criminal detours, allowed Jennifer greater emotional presence, and given the younger characters lifts beyond the lessons Joe needs to learn. It could have stayed quiet after its most honest moments instead of reaching immediately for another joke. Those limitations prevent it from becoming the sharper generational comedy hidden inside its premise. The screenplay sees the emotional destination, but the road toward it is crowded with familiar turns. Still, I cannot dismiss the warmth that survives the disorder. Mason, Nick, Hunter, and freshmen gradually stop feeling like a demographic Joe has entered to study. They become people whose fears challenge his assumptions about age, masculinity, commitment, and friendship. Joe does not emerge from the weekend younger. He emerges slightly less frightened of the person time has made him. That is a modest transformation, but an honest one. This film will connect most deeply with you if you enjoy broad ensemble comedies and can forgive uneven plotting for the sake of chemistry. It may also find you at the right moment if you have ever felt professionally displaced by a changing culture, or if you have mistaken novelty for possibility and stability for stagnation. You may struggle with it if you need tightly constructed farce, consistently sharp jokes, or supporting characters developed with equal care. The movie repeatedly approaches emotional depth and then steps away before the silence can fully settle. For most people, streaming is the right home for it. It is easy to watch with friends, responsive to the energy of a shared room, and unlikely to demand ownership unless the cast's chemistry becomes especially meaningful to you. My rating is 6.3 out of 10 because 72 hours is frequently louder than it is precise, but inside that noise is a sincere reminder that growing older does not mean losing your place. It means learning that your place cannot be measured by how many strangers are watching. And when the final vibration fades, the most important image is not a phone lighting up, it is a man finally looking away from it. Thank you for spending these 72 hours with me and for staying long enough to look beneath the party, the panic, and the performance. This is why the Cineflux exists, to remain with a film after its loudest moments have passed and ask what was quietly moving underneath them. Not every movie needs to be perfect to contain something worth carrying. Sometimes a flawed comedy can still recognize a fear we have never clearly named. I would love to know where you landed on 72 hours. Did Joe's emotional transformation feel earned to you, or did the ending forgive him too easily? Which member of the younger group deserved more time and development? And do you think the film's generational ideas gave it a distinct identity, or did the familiar bachelor party structure ultimately overwhelm them? Share your thoughts in the comments. There is always more to discover when a film passes from one person's experience into another's. And if this essay gave you a different way to see the film, you can support the Cineflux by liking the video and subscribing. More importantly, return whenever you want to slow down, listen closely, and experience cinema as something more than a story moving across a screen. Until then, protect the memories that were created with you, not merely the images collected around you. That is the Cineflux. I will see you in the next one.